It that alters sanity greets you. During the open beta for version 1.2, I played an Ottoman campaign and then a Japan one. Both decent powers weighed down by the old ways, modernizing the state to compete economically and or militarily on the world stage is the common shape of a Vic-3 campaign. Doing so requires changing the laws that shape your state, which requires support from interest groups that are in turn supported by your pops. The first two dev diaries for v1.3 reveal there'll be more laws to handle in the future. I'll make another lecture when that hits and has had the usual post-release patches. For now, this is what's in version 1.2. We know the core mechanic won't change. Changing laws requires support from interest groups, some of which will be opposing your intent. Interest groups get their clout from pops, and you have control over what pop types live in your state, i.e. what jobs you make available. In a previous lecture, I showed which buildings contribute to growing which interest groups. This one will give you some direction on what order to create new jobs. Player agency in Vic-3 is about collecting taxes and spending it. The pops who are at the top of the hierarchy in early game don't like that. The landowners want to keep the riches from the land for themselves, not give it to the state. Thus, your first few law changes are likely to involve butting heads with this interest group. Look at how many law groups they care about. Most other interest groups have a smaller agenda. Landowners start with so many laws they like, you can afford to change some of them, and they'll still fully approve of the government in the steady state. To clarify, when the law changes, this has a big temporary effect on interest group approvals that slowly decays over the years. Change too many laws in a short time, and you'll have a revolution on your hands. Whether this is desirable is up to you. It's high risk, high reward. Let's start with taxation. Many interest groups would prefer moving away from land-based, so it shouldn't be hard to find suitable allies to champion per capita taxation. The law requires currency standards, which should either already be known or be quick to research. The catch: you can't propose this change while traditionalism is enshrined in the law. One way out of traditionalism is agrarianism. The trade unions have no power in the early game, nor are you going to find an anarchist leader. So this is a struggle by the farmers and capitalists to convince aristocrats to give up some power. The romanticism tech is era 1, it's a speed bump, and you'll need some time to prop up these interest groups anyway. Note that constructing new farms will create aristocrat jobs as well as the pop types who support rural folk. Another way out of traditionalism is interventionism. Rural folk are indifferent to this. It's a straight up fight between capitalists and aristocrats. The landowners would rather have agrarianism than this, since aristocrats still benefit from an economy focused on farming. There's another snag. To propose interventionism, serfdom must be abolished. What is serfdom? A rough answer is a light, indirect form of slavery. Peasants do not have the freedom to move or change jobs. They must work the designated land for their whole lives to benefit the owner of that land. The fight to repeal this law is once again the industrialists and rural folk versus the landowners. The intelligentsia are a possible ally in this push. Again, the landowners will not be pleased. If you are adverse to revolutions, maybe start with agrarianism as a stepping stone before shifting to interventionism. That will not please the rural folk who now side with the landowners to oppose this. Until the trade unions get strong in Era 3 in the society tech tree, this will be difficult for early game industrialists to win. Maybe you'll find a market liberal leading some other interest group to assist you. Another issue where industrialists face off against landowners: social security. Paying to keep the poor off the streets will mitigate radicalization. They're no longer starving, so they're not angry, and the poor laws also nerf their political clout while they're on welfare. Ideally, you'd have no unemployment, but real campaigns can have messy moments, to say nothing of the real world. On a tangent, keep an eye out on how many peasants are employed at subsistence farms when building centralized farms. Less people are employed at a proper farm than a subsistence farm. My Japan campaign made the mistake of building farms to combat unemployment. That just created more unemployed. So, which pop types stand behind the landowners? Take the numbers on these plots with a pinch of salt, as I'm summing the weights in a naive way. I'll mention some caveats for specific interest groups as they come up. This is also not taking into account bolstering or suppressing an interest group. Still, landowners are an easy interest group to understand. The majority of aristocrats believe in the continued dominance of themselves. A small fraction of clerics, officers, and farmers think it's best if the aristocrats sit at the top. Nobody else likes them. What do the minority of landowners believe in if it's not their own supremacy? Piety, intellect, and military might. Traditional specializations of the nobility who don't inherit the title, granting them the right to receive the bounty of the land. The rural folk only accept pops who live in the countryside. Urban pops subscribe to trade unions instead, an interest group stunted in clout until around Era 3 in social tech. Among the people working the land, many identify themselves as rural folk, especially the farmers and peasants. Of interest is the sizable number of clerics who believe in them instead of the devout interest group. The priests who think more about the real people in front of them than the scriptures they teach. Note there are no bureaucrats who support the rural folk in this diagram. That changes if you have government-run farms in a command economy at Era 4 of society tech. Who else do farmers believe in, if not themselves? A few believe aristocrats ought to be above them. Others put religion or military at the core of their faith. What about the skillful but underappreciated peasant? Unlike farmers who have some status, the lowly peasant doesn't like the aristocrat they serve. If your peasants contribute any political clout at all, it will first go to the rural folk, and then to the devout, and a little to the army. Peasants are no stranger to being drafted for war, and some may know what it's like to be occupied by hostile foreign forces. In the days covered by EU4, army logistics meant pillaging supplies from the countryside. The peasants remember that. The industrialists are another simple interest group to understand. Most capitalists believe their own interests matter the most. A small fraction of engineers and shopkeepers also believe capitalists should sit at the top of the hierarchy, i.e., the next beneficiaries from industry after the factory owners. Who else do capitalists think of if not themselves? Half that minority trust smart people, i.e., the scientists and inventors, not the same thing, who enabled the capitalist in the first place. The remainder have religion and the army at heart. Not every capitalist is a soulless money grubber. The rural folk and industrialists don't always see eye for eye. Japan starts with isolationism, and the industrialists will bitterly fight to have that change so that they can ship their product overseas for profit. This is against the wishes of the rural folk who would be threatened by import of cheap foreign produce. By the way, losing a diplomatic play or war where force open market is a demand immediately changes your law to free trade, and the industrialists will love you for losing. A bigger fight between rural folk and industrialists is on border controls. Letting natives out and foreigners in is a worry for rural parents seeing their children go away for work and outright scary to xenophobes. The capitalists want the workforce to freely relocate to where the jobs are. The Victorian era was still a time when going to war was a viable way to increase the profitability of your state. It was only after World War II that governments accepted the cost of war had become too high for war to make economic sense. So, you will need an army unless you believe you can convince other states to always fight for you. Most players aren't pacifists in game either, so the army won't just be for self defense. So, what does it take to keep this vital instrument of state in good working order? Perhaps the largest concern is the army model. Traditionally, the landowners drafted up peasant levies, gave them cheap weapons and minimal training, then marched them off to be fodder on the battlefield. This makes landowners more important in exchange for a smaller footprint on the national budget. It'll do for the early game of an emerging economy, but it can't compete with what advanced economies do to organize violence. How important is it that the armed forces are happy? Again, when you're an emerging economy, you won't have military costs, so you can easily overlook the wasteful ways of the slighted soldier. Later on, you really want them happy to get peak patriotic performance out of them. Suppose you are chipping away at the early game laws which empower the landowners with multipliers to the clout. You also want a decent standing army, so you don't want national militia. Then you must pick the professional army, since the other choice of mass conscription requires Era 3 tech. The armed forces will love you for giving them real status, independent of the whims of aristocracy. Likewise, the rural folk will prefer it because recruitment will be voluntary, not mandatory. If you want to jump straight to mass conscription, accepting the early game boost to landowner clout, then it's the trade union who will support that instead of the rural folk. Enlistment officers can be researched around the time the higher tiers of army production methods come online, which peasant levies disallow. Expect the landowners to be extra unhappy about this change, but by mid-game your strategy for dealing with them should have matured to account for this. Going from professional army to mass conscription is tricky. Now the rural folk and armed forces are siding with the landowners to oppose this. Unless you have absurdly powerful trade unions, you will need other interest group leaders who want this to win the fight. I'll discuss it at the end why having a very powerful trade union might not be good for you. Colonialism, the second institution of EU4. Not every country took exploration or expansion ideas to make their own colonies. If your state is one of those that missed out, you can change that in Vic 3 by enacting this law. That and figuring out how to cope with malaria. Armed forces like having any kind of colonialism. It gives them purpose. The industrialists like it too, since it gets them more resources, workers, and consumers to work with. Rural folk dislike foreign goods and people disrupting their way of life. What about the police? Landowners want enforcement of laws because they benefit from said laws. The army wants disciplined life to be enforced on citizens. Rural folk don't like having yet more authority figures tell them what they can or can't do. If you can afford the bureaucracy cost of having police, this is a useful boost to landowner approval ratings in the other game when you're busy stamping out their vested interests in other laws. So, who supports the armed forces? Unsurprisingly, the majority are those employed by the armed forces. Everyone else has some minority or who are supportive of them, provided they are not discriminated against. Those who are systematically discriminated by the law will not support the fighters who can most effectively enforce that prejudice. Who else do soldiers support besides themselves? Religion has its place for those who don't know when they'll prematurely die in a war. They are also sympathetic to trade unions, the grunts of the economy who have learnt group discipline, just like the soldier. Meanwhile, officers believe in landowners instead of trade unions. Many officers have ties to nobility, and hierarchical responsibility is the bedrock of both aristocrat and military officer. The intelligentsia, the smart people who believe in the triumph of modern reason over primal instinct. Depending on what style of government you're steering towards, they are your ally or your enemy, but you will have them around. Collecting taxes requires smart people. Generating bureaucracy requires smart people. International trade requires smart people. If they are powerful, loyal, and your laws enable migration, their propaganda can bring in a lot of new working hands. Usually that's a good thing, since migrants will check if there's job availability before making the move. A quick note on taxation capacity. Many backwards countries at game start have very low tax collection rates. The solution to increasing your budget isn't to build more and more government administration. You need to pay the staff who are inefficiently collecting more taxes for you. Mind, if your goal is to increase the clout of the intelligentsia, it's a legit way of creating more jobs that appeal to this interest group. What you want for a bigger budget is to advance in laws and tech to unlock better taxation capacity modifiers. Quality, not quantity. The intelligentsia were indifferent to police being established, but they will fight back if you want the police militarized. The armed forces want maximum security since giving up freedom is just common sense to trained soldiers. To them, the secret police is no different to being conscious of fellow soldiers and officers. Lax discipline gets you killed. possibly after court-martial. The intelligentsia do not like having to watch what they say, just in case some unheard-of idea is mistaken for disloyalty. The flip side is guaranteed liberties. Intelligentsia agree some kind of home affairs is good to have for safety, but it should be carefully regulated, no matter how hard that makes the job of protection. Next is slavery. The idea of treating fellow humans like dumb livestock really grates on the believers of rationale. A desecration of a brain capable of thought. The slavers have stronger feelings about this if the government dares suggest emancipation, i.e., government confiscation of private property. Note that landowners pick up pro-slavery beliefs if the law allows them. This way, they won't try to bring back slavery once the law is passed unless a leader whips them up. Who believes in the triumph of modern reason? The people whose job it is to read, think, and organize. Academics are the obvious supporters, but so too are the bureaucrats and clerks who deal with paperwork. A minority of capitalists and aristocrats also believe in the power of the intellect to bring benefits to the ruling class. Note that intelligentsia and devout support also take into account the literacy rate of the pop. These numbers don't take that into account, so expect a larger fraction of these pop types to support the intelligentsia, especially the academics who get plus 50% access to education and so will have very high literacy rates. Also, note that none of the clergymen support intelligentsia. There are smart people among the clergy, but they have a very different belief. Who do academics support if not their own intellect? Many put their lot in with the petty bourgeoisie. The humans are not perfectly rational creatures, even those who have capacity for great feats of intellect. Some are sympathetic to trade unions, since the ways of putting pressure on unreasonable bosses is the same between factory workers and paperwork grunts. Bureaucrats have similar leanings to academics, just with less fervor towards intellect. Note this pop type has a lot of caveats for their interest group support. This slide shows the naive calculations which don't factor for how trade buildings nerf clout and that bureaucrats can work on farms. That's in addition to not factoring in high literacy rate boosting intelligentsia support. Also bear in mind that petty bourgeoisie require the pop to be working in certain buildings. Universities, art academies, and government administration meet that requirement, but bureaucrats can be elsewhere too. This slide is a crude attempt to estimate what command economy does to interest group support. Bureaucrats ruling over farms are disqualified from supporting trade unions and petty bourgeoisie in exchange for qualifying to support rural folk. The previous section talked of the wants of the smart people who believe in cold rationale, the inventiveness of the cold mind. That's not the only natural ideology of smart people. Science and religion are popularly portrayed as antagonists to each other, especially over the matters of evolution and heliocentrism. Religion was also part of the stratocracy in the earlier eras, as players of EU4 and CK3 will know. In Vic3, provided they're not marginalized, they still are part of the stratocracy, giving authority to the state if they are happy. Setting aside the politics of religion, what is this social phenomenon a manifestation of? Intellect. Smart people of antiquity trying to make sense of the world and pass down their conclusions to future generations. The painstaking discipline of science hadn't been invented back then. Heck, many people in today's era cannot stick to the intellectual rigor of science, taking shortcuts to arrive at hasty conclusions with no awareness of error margins. Yet our civilization depends on people making conclusions that are good enough quickly to function as leaders and advisors. If someone chooses to embrace the wisdoms of past intellectuals, that does not automatically disqualify them from being smart. The key is how they interpret the teachings and how they adapt it to account for the changing circumstances of time and place. In Vic 3, the unhappy devout will hurt your education access, which is a problem for modernizing your economy. Or perhaps you want that to compound with a lack of education, except where you mandate social mobility. An illiterate population will have less clout and thus be easier to rule. The first clash between the old and the new intellects is over censorship. Intelligentsia believe they can win their arguments provided it's unfiltered. The devout get triggered by sacrilegious disrespect and blasphemy being allowed. Similarly, the trade unions want every voice to be heard since they represent the repressed grunts that are expected to grind day after day to match the tireless machines. The armed forces are unsettled that destabilizing traitorous words aren't being stopped before they do damage. Right of assembly is the middle ground between protected speech and censorship. It's the same people fighting when the law wants to shift from that middle ground to fully protected speech. How is government legitimacy decided? Autocracy is the starting law for many states. In the latter half of EU4 days, countries strive to push up their absolutism. That is autocracy. One person making all the decisions. Aristocrats love that, as it's basically how they want to run the lands, solely at their decisions. Opposing this are the intelligentsia, who want everyone to have a say since smart people can convince others to vote their way. Trade unions also want everyone to have a say so the oppression of workers can be kept in check. Industrialists dislike autocracy as they don't want to have to wait on one person to give permission for every important business decision. Wealth voting is one of the middle grounds between full autocracy and full democracy. The rich get to vote. Trade unions don't like that, but still prefer it to absolutism. The other proponents believe they can qualify to make those votes count. Having any kind of voting opens the doors to women's suffrage. That gender is not a barrier to voting, even if there are other restrictions like wealth or literacy. Then there's universal suffrage. The idea that every adult man should get one vote, no matter how poor or stupid they are. Industrialists share complete terror and disgust at this with landowners. Intelligentsia are only slightly enthused for this compared to more restrictive voting. Have you arranged the interest groups of your state to pick this fight? After the right to vote comes the question of women's rights. The archaic view that dominated human civilization was that women should stay at home and preserve it while raising children. They could do work outside home too, but the simplistic mindset of the past was that they were accessories for men. Whatever they earned belonged to husbands. In the early eras of civilization, such brutal simplicity was pragmatic considering the utter lack of capacity to handle complexities and the need to expand population despite atrocious child death rate. Staving off starvation and genocidal invaders was a higher priority than being fair to women. By the era of Vic III, civilizations had some leeway to consider fairer arrangements. The first notch, legally acknowledging the right to own property, for women to keep what they earned instead of being forced to hand it over to men. Less birth rate for more workers. Like with voting, intelligentsia and trade unions partner up to fight the old ways. Unlike voting, it's the devout who stand in the way, not the landowners. The devout want to care for the sick and wounded. The lowly workers appreciate having treatment when the dangerous machines harm them in an accident. The industrialists would rather medical expertise wasn't concentrated in the hands of the clergy. Go to public healthcare and the industrialists are further disgusted. The devout do not want to lose their importance of being the medical caretakers of the population. The trade unions will have to go it alone in this fight. As an aside, the preferred healthcare arrangement for industrialists is private health, that the rich should be kept alive with their own fortune and the poor are expendable. Next, schools. Nobody opposes the formation of schools. So long as you can afford the bureaucracy and other laws allow it, you'll make schools happen. What kind of school? Now that's where the friction happens. Take private schools. It's forbidden if you have state religion. A secular education. The devout don't like that, which makes the intelligentsia like it since it weakens the devout. High literacy favors intelligentsia support at the expense of the devouts. Trade unions would appreciate any education at all and aren't fussed at the curriculum. Industrialists like to flex their wealth to tailor the curriculum to their benefit. Note, this is the only school type allowed under serfdom. About state religion. This is the ultimate battleground between the intelligentsia and devout. Two conflicting beliefs of how smart people should be spending their time. Whether adherence to the old wisdom should be legally required or not. On a similar front, to go for religious schools and later to switch to public schools is an affront to the devout, so the intelligentsia will be there to push this through. Trade unions love access to education without worrying about the costs. So, who supports the devout? Every pop type has a few people supporting them, provided they believe the state religion. A surprisingly low percentage of clergymen actually support the devout. A reminder that high literacy counts against devout support for non-clergymen. So, who do the clergymen believe in then, if not the supremacy of their religion? Again, the numbers get complicated. Clergymen working in the countryside are liable to side with rural folk instead of the devout. Those who work in, say, urban centers can sign up for trade unions or side with petty bourgeoisie. In the other game, most clergymen will be working in the countryside. They don't have to change their jobs to significantly change their support between devout and rural interests. The petty bourgeoisie, the slightly rich workers of the city who have benefited from the state. The middle managers who may have a handful of tenants to collect some surplus income from. Entry to this interest group depends on working in the city and belonging to the primary culture. Contrast to trade unions who only ask that pops aren't working in the countryside. Trade unions represent the interests of lowly workers. Bourgeoisie are the middle class who act as small-time landlords to those workers. We've peeked at where they stand on some laws earlier, but they typically be small when those laws get passed. The most notable is their reactionary stance on open borders. They would prefer people didn't intermingle. On discrimination, the bourgeoisie side with the devout in opposing the minor slackening of discrimination. Intelligentsia have a slight preference for not letting culture differences get in the way of acceptance. Interestingly, the landowners don't have an opinion on this. If you want to remove the monarch, the bourgeoisie will form a coalition with the devout and landowners. As trade unions grow, the bourgeoisie will also grow as cities require more managers of trade and governance. Since the intelligentsia and bourgeoisie draw support from similar pop types, you might be able to mount reasonable chances of passing the law with some bolstering and suppression. Likely you'll need some other leader sympathetic to your cause to pull this off. The intelligentsia and bourgeoisie both prefer hereditary bureaucrats to be changed out to the disadvantage of landowners. They disagree on how the bureaucrats should be picked. Appointment favors the smart. Meantime, provided some forming of voting is part of the government, the bourgeoisie favor elected bureaucrats. By my naive calculations, a lot of city folk will lean towards the bourgeoisie. They accept manufacturing workers as members. The key boost comes from shopkeepers and then clerks, who are singled out by the data files to have additional weight. Like the farmer who puts interests of landowners ahead of their own, some workers are more sympathetic to the concerns of fellow city dwellers than the more direct interests of factory workers. And note that a lot of shopkeeper jobs get replaced by capitalist jobs as you switch to more modern production methods. Clerks can swing between the intelligentsia and bourgeoisie. They are also partial to trade unions. Given you'll never get rid of clerks, it is useful they are flexible in their beliefs. Shopkeepers are more consistent with putting their interests first. On the flip side, it's relatively easy to remove those jobs for capitalists. Assuming your campaign is one of heavy industrialization, by late game you've overthrown the landowners, and maybe the industrialists are the big bads being a thorn to your agenda. The rural folk may be marginalized as most of the jobs in your country are in the cities and you're importing all your food. The countryside is full of subsistence farms with zero peasants employed. Who do you call on to champion your laws? Trade unions. Now they are powerful, their members plentiful, and well educated. A voice that can't be ignored. If they are happy, you'll get a boost in throughput in your GDP earning powerhouses. A boost you may end up dependent on. What happens if they get happier? You get more workers. Do you have enough jobs for those extra workers? If not, they will burden your social welfare costs. Don't have welfare despite having such strong trade unions? You will be flooded with radicals. Can you handle the plus 10% workforce ratio? What if it's doubled because trade unions have 20% clout? Have you dominated the international market so the world depends on your plentiful workers? First, let's revisit taxation. In the early game, industrialists fought with landowners to move from land-based taxation to capita-based. The proletariat aren't satisfied with that. They want the rich to pay proportionally more tax. Now, industrialists stand beside landowners to prevent further tax changes. By this point, the state will get a sizable boost in tax revenue if this gets passed. Will you bolster the trade union for the money? Trade unions actually preferred peasant levies over a professional army. It's another group of elites that won't listen to the plight of the proletariat. That didn't matter in the early game if you just wanted to shave away at landowner clout. In heavy industry late game, trade unions will go up against everyone else who cared about the army structure to push for mass conscription. Among other things, it's a sizable boost to training rate. You can't scale your army fast if you start late. Soldiers take time to train, unlike civilian workers. Social welfare. Industrialists wanted some light expenses to keep the hobos off the streets. Trade unions want proper pensions with dignity. Pensions are a serious burden. Will your state shoulder that for the people? Child labor. Industrialists would rather children be put to work so they become useful, docile workers sooner. Trade unions want their children to have a chance at a better life. To go straight from full child labor to compulsory primary school might trigger a revolution. Consider the intermediate step of restricting child labor from the factory floor to soften the blow. Labor rights. It's not enough that serfdom is banned. Trade unions want safety regulations to prevent accidents at work. Industrialists don't want external agents interfering with the pursuit of profit. Landowners likewise dislike some other power telling them what they can or can't do with the lowborn. The same fight repeats when introducing minimum wage. Trade unions love it because it makes each of their members more valuable. Industrialists would rather have the freedom to employ multiple, very cheap personnel to do the job of one skilled worker if it's profitable. A reminder that trade unions are for people who don't work in the countryside. Machinists and laborers are specifically picked out to have extra weight. Jobs with authority, including shopkeepers, are specifically banned from being in trade unions. Again, the naive calculations of this diagram need to be navigated. Rural folk and trade unions are mutually exclusive. You either work in the countryside or you don't. A low-skill laborer in the countryside is highly likely to believe in rural folk. One that's in the city will be splitting attention between trade unions and petty bourgeoisie. Similarly, the machinist is either working in the countryside or not. Farms get more automated and need skilled machinists to look after them. If you were struggling to keep radicals low when trade unions are powerful and loyal, you will now deal with the true last boss. Ideologies that don't even exist at game start. That was how my Turkey campaign ended. I failed on the fifth revolution. They kept coming, because my economy wasn't keeping my people employed and happy, but I didn't want to bear maximized social welfare costs. Women's suffrage is more than just equal voting rights. It's also equal employment rights. Can you handle a further 15% workforce ratio on top of what the trade unions throw in? If you gave women the right to own property and then feminism comes knocking, there will be no interest group other than your feminist leader's one that wants this change. Intelligentsia and devout stand united in horror on the suggestion women are treated as equals. The egalitarian trade unions also can't quite grasp this. Such is patriarchy ingrained in the minds of Victorian citizens. You might need a revolution to make this law change happen, and even if you succeed, can you give jobs for all these women who want to work? You do not want to scorn them by legally granting them equality but not economically. Now, if you started from no women's rights to go direct to women's suffrage, you'll have a much easier fight. The devout will likely radicalize, but you can handle that by late game, right? Want to embrace multiculturalism and make prejudice illegal. This is such an unfathomable change to the Victorian citizens that both devout and intelligentsia stand united in rejecting it, alongside the bourgeoisie. Which interest group will be led by someone that wants this to pass? The road to communism. Not even trade unions naturally think to put themselves in the ruling class. The rich, the smart, they all band together to oppose this. How will this succeed? That is the selling point of the next DLC. Agitator characters. So to conclude, the early game is marked by the player trying to get more tax and agency, while the landowners get in the way. To stay up to date with the armies of the world, you will need to keep the armed forces happy from mid-game onwards. Whether and when you make your people stick to agrarian pursuits or to urbanize, industrialize, will influence the timing of which laws are easier to change. Late-game heavy industrial states will need to decide how to handle the trade union and feminism, which risk flooding your job market, jacking up the number of radicals. Feedback below would be appreciated. I make no guarantee I'll be quick to respond to feedback or requests for correction, but I do intend to renew these slides as Victoria 3 gets patched across the future. It that alters sanity thanks you for your time.